This episode is brought to you in partnership by Clay Cooley Automotive, family-owned, family-operated automotive company serving the local DFW Metroplex for over 22 years. Clay, thank you for all you're doing to make intersections possible.
Kyle, Margaret Spellings, politics, education, and a lot of lessons learned.
Well, she kept saying we want to keep the main thing. And what she referenced by that was really just the education of America's people in a lot of ways. It's reading, it's math, it's the basics of how to get someone educated for an adaptable, ultimately future career.
I really enjoyed her, clearly talking about all the education issues and the challenges we've got. But it was fun also to talk about her first contacts and interactions with George W. Bush before he had won anything, much less following him all the way through the White House.
State government, national government, Secretary of Education, the Bush Center. She also then just led the University of North Carolina education system, and she's now part of the Bipartisan Policy Center. Welcome to Intersections, where we take a multi-generational look at the critical issues facing America. Tom, this is going to be really fun.
It will be. Fascinating career. Margaret Spellings, involved in Texas politics, got involved with George W. Bush as governor, followed into the White House, policy advisor, then Secretary of Education, then took on the University of North Carolina system, 17 different campuses involved there, has also been involved in high-profile research institutions, as CEO of both the Bush Center and Texas 2036, and now heads up the Bipartisan Policy Center. I didn't know there was a word bipartisan in Washington.
Does that still exist?
But the Bipartisan Policy Center.
It absolutely does. Somebody asked me recently when I introduced myself, they said, "Do you work alone?"
That's right.
No,
That's right.
no, I don't.
Margaret, with all of that broad career, and again, I guess the two kind of general pieces that I see jump out there are hard politics and hard education. What are kind of the core principles that have kind of led you through all those different positions and very high profile, difficult positions?
Well, I obviously wouldn't have shown up to work at the Bipartisan Policy Center if I didn't believe that people are starving for good public policy around things they care about deeply. Democrats and Republicans and everybody else, your mom and them, as we would say in Texas, on education, on health, on quality of life, housing, law enforcement, those things that we really have so much more in common than separates us. And when you use political capital and the bully pulpit, the political process generally to bring people together and do that to solve problems, it can work and it's a lot of fun. And I've really had a wonderful career. And I think in the public sector, because they're such big systems and big issues and everybody cares a lot about them, it's a place where you can really make a difference and really do thorny, stimulating, interesting things.
Wonderful and successful. Let's go back to how you got here. So born in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Yeah.
So I assume there's not a whole lot of go big blue stickers sitting around given the Texas.
No. As we always say down here, I mean, I got here as quick as I could. My dad was Canadian. Met my mother at the University of Michigan. He was getting a PhD at the time in geology. And so, long story short, he ended up in the oil and gas business, and I grew up in Houston. So got there at a tender age, and I consider myself, that I grew up in Houston, basically.
And political science at the University of Houston, later Texas A&M.
Okay, so Tom, this is my little deep dark circuit. The secret, the reason I chose political science is because it required 4 fewer credit hours than any other major I was interested in. One of which was journalism. Of course, my parents say, I'm a get in, get out kind of gal. I mean, a results-oriented person. And so, I thought, how can I get in and out of here? 126 hours, I'll take it, political science. And obviously, I was interested in, and that led me into this career.
But then you got the politics and the education came together quick.
Right.
Governor Clements, his commission on the reform of education.
Exactly.
You jumped in as a member of that, and then later as associate director of the Texas Association of School Boards.
Right.
So where did the education come in? Politics, was that something that goes back to childhood? Where did the kind of
I've
focus
always been
on
interested in the political process and politics generally. But what I learned when I showed up at the state legislature and actually worked for Bill Hammond, who you know well, who represented East Dallas and then ultimately the Texas Association of Business, that if you're in state government, the action is in education. More than half of state budgets are spent on K-12 and post-secondary education, also health. So the big thorny things that people care a lot about are in education. During that time with Governor Clements, around the country, and certainly in Texas, you'll remember we were all about school finance litigation, endless lawsuits, and how would the legislature respond to these things. So Edgewood v. Kirby, you remember that back in the day?
Robin Hood.
All of that was that chapter. And so Governor Clements convened a special committee of leading business people that worked on those things, including one of my great mentors, Charles Miller. Our mutual friend Tom Luce here in Dallas worked on behalf of Ross Perot on House Bill 72 and all of the reforms that came out of that. So it's been quite a journey. And, amazingly, many of those same things that we did right and where Texas led, we're now kind of revisiting again. It's turned into a everything old is new again sort of deal, which we'll get into, I'm sure.
Does that mean we didn't have success back then?
No, it means that we were on a upward trajectory. And then the pinch and the pain of accountability starts to set in and people say, wait a minute, and they get distracted. And so we're in a downward period on education achievement. We talked about this the other night at the gala that started before COVID, and we're
accelerating.
We've kind of taken our foot off the gas.
Yeah. Unfortunately.
So talk our audience through a little bit of the personal side. Obviously, you have a deep career in education and politics, but University of Houston, Texas A&M. What were some of the foundational elements that you learned, you just as yourself, that spurred you on to this career?
Well, and I hope this is, I know it's shared by you two, and I hope your viewers that, a person can make a difference and you can put yourself on the field of play and show up and work together and try. So that was something that I, just really enjoyed. And what I also know for sure is these are big things that where we spend a lot of money that matter a lot to families and to the future of our country. I mean, I kind of can't say, I don't want to be like a Texas braggadocio, but what else is more important than making sure that our people, maximize their opportunities?
Absolutely.
The number one asset of our country. So I thought, okay, well, that sounds pretty, mighty, and I want to be part of it.
That's great.
And, my parents were educated and I grew up, I sometimes say, as you all did, not you probably, but, before kids were people too. I mean, we all had jobs after school. We babysat. We, kind of raised ourselves. Both of my parents worked. My mother was a social worker. My dad was a geologist in the 70s and 80s in Houston, Texas, which was kind of a roller coaster ride too. So anyway, it wasn't the kind of candy ass sort of situation that I think kids are in a lot now, where you had to, you had to work. You had to work. Yeah. You had to get out of the house and get to it. And kids were a lot more independent. The world was a little safer, and there was no technology. It was a whole different stew of things. So anyway.
So big move, 1994. George W. Bush decides that he's going to run for governor against a relatively popular incumbent.
Yeah, absolutely. Ann Richards.
Ann Richards.
Yeah.
Good position. A lot of people on the front end didn't give him any chance at all.
Absolutely.
You took on political director for the campaign. So kind of a two-question. One, how did you jump from the governor's commission on reform of education into a heavily political role in what was going to be a very difficult campaign.
And an organizational role. So here's the thing about educational governance. I mean, we have, 1,100 school boards in Texas. I represented them at the time. And you have a feel for local communities and who's who and what's what. So the job of an organizational director in a campaign is those relationships, to recruit a county chairman in every county and to the candidates coming, a week from Tuesday and, get folks together and all the kind of blocking and tackling in a more retail way than we have now. It's gone, much more into the tech world.
Social media.
Yeah, social media and so forth, which I think is a loss, honestly, because people are, in those days, this is, to your point, again, you lose that connection. You lose the opportunity for the candidate to get out and about and listen and learn and see how diverse first our
The state.
state is, but also ultimately the country. And so just that local engagement. And of course, school boards are very, a big part of that local political apparatus.
So how did you get into the campaign?
Yeah.
How all of a sudden
the first step?
Margaret, we want you to be political director.
Well, I met...
And kind of hidden in that two pieces is, what did you see in George W. Bush, who had not won a political campaign at that point, had a business background, but not a political campaign, either in terms of him as a person or the possibilities of a campaign that had been written off by most of the media at that point?
Right. Well, I first met then, Texas Ranger owner, plain old George Bush, through my friend Karl Rove. And Bush had sort of flirted with the idea of, running 4 years prior, briefly. And as I said, Texas public policy and education was all about school finance litigation. And so I knew something about it from my school board days and the Clements Commission and all those sorts of things. So Karl introduced us, and I came up and spent a few hours with him, a little bit of a tutorial, and he was listening and learning and trying to understand, the players and the policy issues. And we just connected. You know him well. He's super smart. He's a sponge for information. He's a listener and a learner. And so I met him. And then 4 years later, when he was building a campaign team, the same cast of characters assembled. And what I'm proud of, and I think it speaks so well of President Bush, is so many of those people that were around him in the early days went to Washington and came back, and we are still, devoted to each other. Very tight-knit group, and a pretty big tight-knit group,
Absolutely.
The Don Evans, the Karen Roves, the Karen Hughes, the Karl Roves, the, on and on. So anyway, it was a fantastic group of people, and that's what life is all about.
Talk us through the campaign. Walk us through, how did the campaign go? Give us your lens on that governor's race.
Well, a lot of, Jim Francis and the like, who, tough taskmasters and so forth. So he had hired a campaign manager, Joe Albaugh, who went on to run FEMA and emergency, preparedness issues in D.C. Anyway, it was a very shoestring operation. I remember our furniture was, turned over cardboard boxes with, computer laptops on top of them, which were not the same kind of laptop we have now. But getting on the phone and the kind of thing I'm telling you, the candidate's going to be in Lubbock, a week from Tuesday. Can you get some folks together and for a lunch and whatnot? So well coordinated, very tight-knit group, and it was a lot of fun.
And then 4 years later, he decides, okay, we're going to make a run at the White House.
4 years later, but in those 4 years, had really proved up that he had the chops.
Had been very successful.
Relationships
because you were involved in the second campaign in 1998. Was reelected relatively easily.
Absolutely. Bob Bullock, Pete Laney, the relationships with the legislature, tackling big things, Bill Ratliff, school finance reform, on and on. I mean, so he had a real track record. So I don't want you to just gloss over that, because you don't run for president successfully without having, done some material things in a big place like Texas. Right. So including on education, I might add.
Talk us through then. Okay, so he makes the decision now to run for the big job.
Yeah.
Where were you kind of in the game of that, and what was that like?
Well, education was a major part of the campaign. No Child Left Behind. I still have the little policy book.
You were really an architect, Margaret, of the No Child Left Behind, which was part of the campaign, talking about I want to be the education president.
Absolutely.
And then especially, and we'll get to it, but the first 9 months of the presidency was really set up
all about it
with Ted Kennedy, with others, on having this piece of legislation being the bulwark of what was going to be 8 years of presidency.
Absolutely. And two things were and are true. One, to the point about bipartisanship, it was a place where if education was your number one issue, prior to George W. Bush, you were a Democrat. Simple as that. And, he virtually closed that gap. That's how potent it was. And I think Karl Rove, Mark McKinnon, that cast of characters will say that it was a big part of the difference maker, which, as you know, it was a pretty tight race in the first instance, and was certainly part of making the difference. That's true. The other thing is that he had a real comfort with that. He knew the policy area. He understood it. He, knew and knows how critical it is to our economic future and so on. And it's it's a positive agenda. And that's, compassionate conservatism. Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, it's a half full, optimistic, we can make the pie bigger, opportunity is here, and it's for everyone. So it was a place of comfort. It was a place of real policy difference making vis-a-vis the politics of it. And it was a place where he was super comfortable with his track record and the results we'd gotten in Texas and his own ability to stomp, if you will, on the issue.
So you move into November 2020, and a lot of times elections are really decided by a single question or issue. One of the ones back then that I remember seeing, which I think says a lot about where it ended up being, was who would you rather go have a beer with sitting on your porch? And I think it was about 83-17 in favor of George Bush. But as you pointed out, it was close. We won't go through all the hanging chads and those.
Yeah.
But I am curious to kind of get your perspective. You were working for the governor, and he would have remained as governor for another 2 years if it had gone the other way.
Yeah.
But yet, you've got the sights set on the White House, but you've got about a 45-day period there where nobody knows what the answer is. Is it Austin or is it Washington?
Right.
What was it like to kind of maneuver through those 45 days of no man's land or limbo, however you want to say it?
Well, and I know you do, and I'm sorry to be kind of name-droppery here, but if you know anything about President Bush, he's an executive, and so we had kind of a real rational game plan of who was doing what. And Clay Johnson and I were tasked with kind of staying home, and he was still the governor and keeping the home fires burning and getting ready for another legislative session, on and on. And that was his responsibility and mine.
To the state.
And so some of us were, charged with staying home and sticking to the knitting, while others went off to Florida to be involved in the various aspects, led by James Baker and so forth. And so there was a real delineation of who's doing what. At some point, when we finally knew, I was also part of the transition team that went to Washington and started to figure out the talent pool, how we were going to organize ourselves for success and so forth. So everybody had a role and responsibility. We kept calm and carried on.
Yeah, and that had to be tough because usually you've got 3 months, you're down to a month and a half, but Christmas is part of that.
Right, exactly.
So pulling that new administration together was a good challenge during that period of time.
That is why, although it doesn't exist really now, you might argue that the Project 2025 was a bit of this, or is this. We had a kind of a manifesto. We knew what we were going to do, and we knew we were going to start with education. And it was pretty specific. It was pretty granular, much more so than what, kind of the bumper sticker sort of campaigns that we're into now. So we had a roadmap, and we knew we needed to build a team, and that was a collective effort and so forth. And we opened, as you say, Tom, right away, first day on the job, bringing, Ted, the big four, so-called, Ted Kennedy, Judd Gregg, George Miller, John Boehner, the principals that were going to be involved in the issue. Interestingly, our fellow Texan Tom DeLay had punished John Boehner, who was ended up with his consolation prize, was the chairman of the House Education and Labor Committee, and ended up being the thing
in the middle.
So that was fun.
So you build that up. That's the anticipation.
Yeah,
that's what George Bush is going to be known for over the next 8 years. Is changing the education
domestic
system,
present education.
National policy.
Then we hit 9/11, and again, you were on the education side, the architect.
Well, at this point, I was a domestic policy advisor.
Domestic policy.
So I had a broad portfolio that included this big priority.
That was a big part of it.
Yeah,
and
it
no
was.
child left behind, as they said. I think you're given credit for being the architect there. And then all of a sudden, 9/11 happens.
Right.
Talk about your reactions, and not just from a country standpoint, but how you manage an issue like this that is going to be the bulwark of the president's, but then all of a sudden is overtaken by events, but yet still is very important to the country.
Absolutely. And I can get real chills when I talk about this. You'll remember on the Capitol steps when every single member of the Congress stood around their leadership and said, we're going to work together. We're productive. It was a kind of a real American moment.
Yeah.
And so a lot of good things. I mean, one of the, I don't want to say silver lining at all, but there was some positive goodwill that came out of that moment, and the need to seize the moment. And so No Child Left Behind, little did I know, I mean, I'd been involved with the state legislature that, you didn't do things, in a months, things were a years-long period. So the fact that we passed No Child Left Behind in about a year, which is super consequential, 50 million school children or whatever, in a very bipartisan way, was pretty amazing. But it was on the ropes, really, in that August, heading into the August recess, and then 9/11 kind of broke the dam, and they got back to work and passed the thing by year end, and it was signed earlier the following year.
And what were the pillars of that piece of legislation? Walk us through just how you thought about it and what those pillars were bipartisanly to attack education.
And I'm proud to say that, the most powerful of those pillars lives on to this day. And it's this idea, although we'll get into kind of the current moment, but the idea that we Americans believe that no matter where you live or what your circumstance, that education is a key part of being successful in this country and in life, period. And we still believe that. I mean, it was sort of a civil rights agenda initially, but whether you're a fiscal conservative and want to make sure your tax dollars are being spent in a way that matters for your community, your state, your country, and your kids are going to have a quality education, and you can count on that. So there were a lot of things that were appealing across the political aisle, whether you're, whatever your point of view, it made a lot of sense. Well, what does that mean? Well, we're going to focus on reading and math. We're going to test every student in grades 3 through 8 and one time in high school. We're going to disaggregate that data, meaning we're going to say, how are the poor children doing? How are the African-American, Hispanic, et cetera? We're going to report it in a way that we can really take action against soft spots and against the problem. And we're going to cause things to happen when they don't. And so this idea about measurement and accountability and transparency and expectation, live on to this day, sort of. We'll get into how it's changed. So the accountability was a big piece. A focus on basic skills like reading, which now is fashionable again. We were ascendant, and then it became reading became quite political. Now the science of reading is sweeping the country. There's a podcast called Sold a Story. If you haven't listened to it, I don't want to hawk somebody else's podcast, but it's a good one.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's all about the reading wars and so forth. So accountability, reading, a focus on teachers and investing in teachers, the central nature of teaching, which was more true then than it is now with AI and technology and so forth, and high expectations. So those are kind of the building blocks of it.
And then second term, George W. Bush, you move into the cabinet.
Right.
From the White House, Secretary of Education. And one of the first issues that comes up, you go against Connecticut in terms of testing some of the pieces that just came out of No Child Left Behind.
Exactly.
And you used a term, soft bigotry.
Right.
Talk about that in relation to the testing, why you thought it was important, and why, as Secretary of Education, you went against the state.
Well, for starters, it was in the new law that we were, and I did not invent that term. President Bush, talked about it a lot on the campaign, soft bigotry of low expectations. And what that means is, as he used to say, and probably still does, just move them through. I mean, we were just flying blind. We really didn't care enough to find out how every kid was doing. And so, put them in the system, shoot them out the other end, and if they have the skills, so be it. If not, too bad.
Too bad. Yeah.
So this was a more laser focus on the achievement of everyone. And states didn't like that, much. Particularly
called accountability.
Particularly when it started to be tied to federal funding and requirements and that sort of thing. But they eventually got on
losing
board.
Federal money.
Losing federal money is always a way to get somebody's attention. We'll get into the current state of affairs. But anyway, and they weren't the only one. Virginia, my current place of residence, I'm not going to say home state here in Texas because I won't. Anyway, it took a minute to get on board. The other thing that's an unheralded and really important reform of the law is every state was required to participate on our National Education Report Card, the NAEP. When we showed up, it was about 30 states, and 30 states this year, a different 30 states next year, and you didn't really have how are we going to keep track with how we're doing collectively? And I think, this is more true today than it was then. Education or math achievement doesn't start at, begin and end at the Oklahoma border. I mean, we're in a globally competitive world, and we really need to have a fuller picture of how we're doing.
Well, let's jump into some of these issues today, because we talk about accountability, we talk about some of the testing,
Mm-hmm.
but yet if you look at COVID,
Mm-hmm.
we had a lot of schools that took the position of, we're just going to push students right through.
Right.
And in fact, you see that an awful lot today.
Yeah.
Whereas based on time, it's not mastery of materials. We'll probably come back to this a couple times.
Yes.
Margaret, have we made any progress in holding schools and states accountable? Because we still have a lot of students that get pushed through. And then come to 8th grade, we find out students that in theory have been in the honor roll can't read.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen, there's a news story in the Atlantic about kids at UC San Diego who can't do 8th grade math. I mean, it's a blue chip kind of university. So here's, I don't want to be a Texas braggadocio, but I'm going to have to be for a second. Here's how you use the federal role. You say, we're going to spend money around this shared objective of opportunity for everybody, and that means you're going to have some level of proficiency in the skills that matter most, math and reading, and we are going to put everybody on a trajectory to measure, to find out, and to do something about it. And actually it's about 14 years that was all of Bush and most of Obama, we were going in the right direction. Not fast, not a rocket ship, but the slope was going up, especially in math. When you say what you want to have happen, and you hold people to account, and you prescribe some resources around the problem, it's the Queen Mary. You can get better. And then, long before COVID, we kind of started on the unwind of the muscle of the accountability system. So states had a lot more fine print, could kind of monkey with the books, if you will. And then we started to see the downward trajectory, and then COVID, and that was the big excuse, like, oh my God, forget it.
It's amazing to me today, and we saw it here in Texas, unfortunately.
Right, yeah.
We think a lot of what's being done in Texas, but a lot of it was, well, we're not meeting the standards, so what we need to do is change the standards.
Lower the score.
Exactly.
Well, that's what I mean with the fine print, cooking the books, whatever. And there's a lot of ways to do that. That's one of them.
Yeah. And that's the problem.
What started the unwind? I mean, you talk about this unwind period pre-COVID.
Yeah, that's a great.
What started that?
That's a fantastic question. It started to get personal for adults. And I love my dear friend Arnie Duncan, who was Obama's first education secretary. Wonderful guy. And we kind of killed the goose that laid the golden egg. They said, okay, all right, well, if kids are going to need to learn and we're going to report it out and we're going to require school boards and resourcing and whatnot, what we really need to do is pay teachers based on how the kids are doing. And all of a sudden, wait a minute, this is personal to the grown-ups.
Got it.
And it raised the ire of the unions, as you would expect. And I'm not saying that that's not a sound thesis that you would use in the private sector, but it ended up creating just a real backlash against the entire thesis of accountability. So let's start back to the ostrich approach, deluding ourselves into no more accountability, no more muscle in the system, et cetera. So that backlash is against testing, too much testing, we've got a stomach ache, all that.
But why do people today, if you look at nationally, in the primary grades, 30% of kids are proficient. That means 70%. 70% have fallen behind. One study I saw said that if you're behind in that 3rd and 4th grade, you've got a 2% chance of getting an associate degree. Not a bachelor's degree, but an associate. So 70% have a 2% chance of any type of education, much less the education that we want to have them. Why aren't people throughout the country outraged and yelling that this is just unacceptable? As you said, there's been some progress made, but when I was mayor, those were roughly the numbers too. We've made some improvement.
Well, we made, and then we went down.
And at times we pat ourselves on the back because we only fail 68% of the students instead of 70.
Yeah.
But if you were running a business, you'd still be bankrupt.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I will say that third proficiency is a third proficiency on NAEP, and it is a much higher standard. If you looked at the Texas data, it would be higher than that, et cetera. So,
but you walked through with me not too long ago. A number of different school districts, they were all below 50%.
Yeah, yes, exactly. So I mean, we can 30, 50, it's still a lot of ways to the system.
And the problem with the 50% is that's a lot of students.
It's a hell of a lot of students.
It is the personal issue of what's their future, but also the societal cost of what is it going to place as a burden in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. No question about it. And a big part of the problem is we're not telling parents the truth. So if you ask them, most parents think my kid's doing great. They got an A's on their report card, and we love our teacher. We like, the Halloween fair, all of that. Everybody's feeling happy and has a pig and slop. But no, they're not doing very well. So parents are not, demanding change. We're not telling them the truth about how their kids are doing and how well prepared they are or are not for their futures.
So where does that problem lie? Like, is that the teacher? Is that the administrator? Like, why can't we be honest with where we are?
How long do you have? Now, you know the answer to that because this is politics.
Yeah.
I mean, we're running on one level, and I don't mean to be cynical. I guess I'm going to say this in public. I mean, we're running a jobs program. It's the largest employer in many, many communities in our state and across this country. People love their school teachers, the school district. We love our Friday night lights. We love the community feeling, and all of that is good and fine. But it's not mutually exclusive with educating students. Right. The other thing that I would say on behalf of the system, not to be an apologist, is we are trying to do something that other countries are not doing. I mean, you hear a lot about Singapore and Finland and Germany and what. Okay, well, they're homogeneous societies who say, you know what, Tom, you're really not smart enough to go to college. Why don't you go over here? Yeah. We are the land of second chance. We are putting ourselves in a position where we have, a belief that opportunity ought to be broadly available. And
I don't want to run away from the teachers union. I'll tell you a story and it was another state, but I was involved in education, leading a business group in another state. And we were in a conversation late at night in my boardroom with the head of the Teachers Association and the number 2 in a conversation over something. And it was late at night. Nobody wanted to be there.
Right.
And finally, the number 2 person looked at me and said, "You just don't understand." I said, "Okay, well, I probably don't understand."
Yeah.
What don't I understand? She goes, "You don't understand. The public school system purpose is to provide a stable employment environment for the teachers." And I said, "You're right. You don't understand." So with that, we've gone through COVID. We've seen districts in Chicago and San Francisco, other ones too, but those are the two biggest ones, where they really took the position that the students are secondary.
Right.
We're not going to go back.
Our health,
and an enormous cost attached to that.
Absolutely.
What do we do about the teachers' associations, the teachers' unions?
Okay, let me just say, I give them an A+ for doing what they are paid to do. They are paid to represent adults. That is what they do, and it's what they do well. Yeah. But we should not, confuse or delude ourselves that they represent students. They don't. We do. We policymakers, we taxpayers. I mean, we're the ones that ought to be knocking on the door of the school board. So, let's understand what their mission is and what they're paid to do, and not expect them to do something that really is not their stated purpose.
Okay. Other answers.
Yeah.
Florida and Arizona, Texas has just followed.
Yeah.
Are trying to throw competition into it.
Yes.
Voucher programs.
North Carolina, lots of places. Lots of places
going. Is that an answer, and how are they working? With some mixed results in Florida and Arizona, as far as I can see.
Yeah, and here's, the way I look at it. Look, if we're going to spend public dollars, we ought to know if we're getting something for it. Just simple as that. I think we are in a time where people and parents should, and certainly the economy, it's agnostic about where your skills are found, whether it's on a computer, in a private parochial school, in a public school, in a charter, et cetera, in a pod at home if you're homeschooled.
Sure.
But if we're spending public money, we ought to get something for it with respect to the value. And so places like Indiana that have had school choice programs for a long time, they have built accountability into their choice systems. And I commend them for that. In other places, including Texas, they have not yet done that.
And walk our listeners, just tell us what that accountability is, just so our listeners have a better
well, in Indiana, it's it's taking a standardized test that can be compared and so forth. Usually the ITBS or something like that. So yeah, they use usually a norm reference test. So you're not teaching the curriculum and those sorts of things, but at least we have a little record. You have a baseline. You know something.
Got it.
But that's the big thorny thicket because we. Listen, do parents know how well, parochial school A versus charter school B versus public school C are doing relative to each other? I don't think so. And I do think, because of transportation and, a lot of the issues, a lot of students are still going to stay in our traditional public schools.
But there are some places now, as you said, that are really putting that out there.
Yeah.
And putting numbers and with high visibility attached to it too.
Exactly.
One of the things I wonder here in Texas, and again, you're the CEO of Texas 2036, so you looked at a lot of the longer term issues in Texas, including education as well as infrastructure.
Health,
There's a whole host of different ones. What I wonder though here in Texas is this may increase the demand, but I'm thinking in terms of Houston, Dallas, San Antonio. I don't see any way that you really increase the number of slots
the capacity
at the private schools for individuals to use it. So let's take a family in South Dallas that may want to send their child
to St. Mark's.
If there aren't any more slots at St. Mark's, Ursuline, or anything else.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. And they're going to say, okay, we've got our $10,000 voucher for a $0.30 education. So St. Mark's, and we're not picking on St. Mark's or anybody in particular.
There's a lot of schools you can list.
Exactly. So somebody's got to make up that delta through scholarship programs or other philanthropy or whatever. Or they're going to say, listen, we're going to allocate 10 spots to the school choice voucher, et cetera. So you're right. I mean, there are a lot of challenges to making it work and to knowing that we're getting something for their money. And I guess one of the things, and whether it's abolishing the Department of Education or so many of these other, transgender bathrooms and Harry Potter in the, library or whatever these things are that are really important to a lot of people, we got to keep the main thing. And that is, how are the kids doing? I mean, what is our proficiency rate on reading and math? Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit watch the birdie.
Have we diluted the curriculum? I know back when, quote unquote, it was basically the fundamental or the core subjects, the math, the reading, the science, and civics, government, something like that. It seems now that we've got a lot of different subjects that are thrown into those primary years. Have we reduced the amount of time on the core subjects that really create the foundation for learning for children?
I don't know. This is where the muscle and accountability system matters. If you say, look, we care most about reading and math and how you're doing, and we're going to resource those issues. And if you want to add everything under the sun, so be it. And frankly, a lot of those things are mutually reinforcing. You can't learn social studies without being able to read. And so, people say this kind of stuff all the time. It's mythology, that we're our relentless focus on reading is causing, social studies scores to degrade. No, they're not. Kids who can read better can perform better across the curriculum.
Absolutely.
So it's a little bit of a red herring, honestly, some of that. The new fad is, work-based learning, experiential learning, and all this sort of hands-on learning. I'm a little skeptical about that. It's cute, and it can engage kids. But it's not a substitute for you're old enough to remember. I mean, you sat down and you memorized the multiplication table.
Yeah, you just knew it.
Yeah.
Well, and if you learn physics, you got to have the multiplication tables too.
That's the facility with it,
Right.
Yeah.
But part of this too is, if we look at our education system, the calendar that we use really goes back to the agrarian society when kids had to be free to go out
work in the field and so on.
In the fields and that sort of thing. But it also seems even today, we talked about it, or at least touched on it a little bit earlier, that we move people based on time in place.
Yeah.
Not by mastery of material.
Right. And that, technology, AI, that is going to be one of the big change elements, is this mastery versus time. And you're right, it's an old kind of model. And, the agrarian economy has been replaced with the Six Flags and camp economy, whatever you want to call it. Families want their summers together and so forth. So it's kind of high class problems now. But yeah, I think we're ultimately moving to that. And frankly, we're doing more of this kind of thinking in higher ed at the moment with certifications, badges. In the One Big Beautiful Bill, there's a provision for what's called workforce Pell grants. So not just a Carnegie unit, baccalaureate kind of environment, but how do you use this badging and so forth, and use, public support for a real skill that's valuable in the marketplace. So, we're getting to that. But slow.
You were also very much involved in setting up a commission to look at the reform of higher education. In fact, you actually said higher education was an elephant, quote unquote. So what that commission became known as was the Spellings Commission.
Yeah, I didn't name it that. It was called the Commission on the Future.
I understand that, but it was referenced as the Spellings Commission.
And still known as that, yeah.
And really what you did is question the efficacy in a lot of cases of higher education.
Yeah.
So talk about higher education today, how you saw it back then, and the issues surrounding it. Because, again, you threw a lot of question marks at that time.
Yeah.
There's a lot of question marks today.
Well, and, I don't want to be immodest. Okay, it's about 20 years ago, 15 to 20 years ago, that we were talking about accountability, affordability, and access. We've done a better job on access over time, financial support, enriched Pell Grants and whatnot. Frankly, some would say student loan giveaways, but more attention on the affordability. I'm on the access piece, less so on accountability. But and people were Johnny-come-latelys because it was controversial at the time. But it makes me wonder if we had embraced and attended to some of these things, prior and in that time frame, if there would be the skepticism about higher ed, about the value, about what's happening there, about the curriculum, about freedom of speech, about all these things, if we had been clearer about what we expected and what we were investing in.
So you just really identified three different buckets. One was affordability.
Yep.
Two was applicability to the workforce.
Yes.
And three was, for lack of a better term, the culture of higher education.
Yeah.
So affordability, we spent a lot of money.
Right.
In terms of education, roughly $1 trillion plus or minus. Haven't got a lot of benefits we've talked about on K through 12.
Yeah.
Challenge when you get into higher education. When you look at the cost of higher education, Margaret, what are your thoughts? We've seen the numbers go straight up at institutions.
Yeah.
We've seen the ability to pay debt back when debt comes with it go down and down.
Right.
What's the thought on affordability? Have we put too much money into non-educational stuff at schools?
Here's the thing. If you're running a university, as I did, there's a lot of just legacy costs that you can't get yourself out of because of tenure, because of, a lot of things. And so if you're running a big public university and you're running a fill-in-the-blank program, I don't want to name anything and, be on PC or whatever, you can. But an unsubscribed or undersubscribed program that costs a lot of money and people don't necessarily see a value in the marketplace, you at the university are saying, well, what are we going to do with the 5 tenured professors who, are there for life if they want to be? And we can't, enroll enough students in the program. And so programs and the business school, frankly, teacher education, they become kind of a cash cow along with other things. Housing is a big thing that is a moneymaker for universities, real estate, et cetera, that augment the losing businesses, if you will, that they have in other parts of the enterprise. And so I'm sympathetic in one way is because their hands are tied behind their back. They can't, in the structures and hidebound nature of higher education, make the changes they need to make to keep the price down often.
In some of the work that I actually did at the Bipartisan Center years ago, we looked at the rise in cost of administrative costs at the college university versus faculty costs.
Yeah.
And what you had was the line for faculty, it wasn't flat, but inching is a good number.
Yeah.
The administrative, lack of a better term, overhead, it was going like this.
Right.
And I call that non-education.
Yeah, absolutely.
What do we do to try to get that back in line so that the resources at least are going to educate the students as opposed to where I've seen more and more deans of whatever it is.
Yeah, well, a big part of that is compliance. And, the other thing about especially
federal regulation.
Federal regulation and state regulation too. University governance, research, when you take research dollars, as many of them do, most of them do, there are reporting and compliance and environmental and every other kind of regulatory requirement that goes with that money. And so the cost of complying with that is high.
So I'll ask the dumb question.
Yes.
For a younger audience and a younger listener, is higher education worth it? Is it worth the investment?
It can be.
Say more.
Okay. Well, I don't happily my children are out of college, but consumers need to be a lot smarter, and this is why accountability is important too. If you're you can get a high quality higher education anywhere in this country online, at your local, starting at your local community college, and on and on and on. And so, and brand is becoming less and less important given this mastery signal and the economic signal that's frankly, more powerful in higher education because there's a more immediate economic return than in K-12. But yeah, sure. I mean, if you want a good education and you're smart about how you do it, you should start at your local community college. You should transfer to your public university, and you should be very efficient in the way you map your way through college. And we do a very poor job of that. Kids are changing their majors. We don't know what they're in. A lot of electives. Et cetera. So, if you back to the 126 hours and pick a political science, you got to get in and get out. I mean, that's the most important thing. And frankly, a big part of our debt problem is students who've taken a ton of debt and have no credential of value. Yeah, exactly. And that's the most chronic problem.
Well, let's talk about that because that's really the marriage of bucket 1 and 2.
Right,
the
exactly.
affordability and the applicability for the economy that we have today.
Right, exactly.
It's student debt.
Yes.
That student debt we've all seen increase substantially. The prior administration had a view that what we need to do is eliminate that, write it off. The federal government writes it off, which is another way of saying taxpayers does.
Yeah, it's a disaster.
Thoughts on that?
Yes, I'm not a fan. Well, first of all, but prior to the Obama administration, we had a student loan system that was essentially a public-private partnership. Then we took the entire thing into the federal government, and it was supposed to be a big moneymaker, and it's now, I think, $300 billion in the hole. And we, did all these giveaways, student loan forgiveness.
It was free
money, COVID forbearance, on and on and on. And, I do think there's a real principle in, if it's for free, you don't value it. Right. And you'll take all the time in the world,
Yeah.
And so there's no motivation to get in and get out because it's not on your nickel. And I'm sympathetic to these issues where people have made an economic decision for their own families that said, I can't afford to go to higher ed. And then look, here's over here with $250,000 worth of debt or loan forgiveness, forbearance recipe. And they're working at Starbucks if they're lucky.
Or the person that just paid off all of their debt.
Yes.
And to see the next person.
Right, exactly. So there's a real fairness issue that I think chafes people, including me.
The prior administration, the Obama administration, focused on what's called gainful employment.
Right.
And you served on the board of a for-profit institution, which was the focus of gainful employment, which was basically saying we're going to look at the repayments of loans at each institution, and we're going to hold the institutions accountable.
Right. And, and what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And I think we ought to
Public versus private, both.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we ought to have those same expectations for-profit, for our HBCUs, for our HSIs, for our comprehensives, for our teachers' colleges, and for our flagships.
I think there's like 20 programs at the University of Texas that would have failed miserably.
Yeah.
Under those measurements.
Absolutely.
And some of them were at the law school.
Yeah, absolutely. So, truth in advertising. But the premise...
Do you like the premise, though?
I do like the premise.
We're going to go back to the institution and say, if your loans aren't there, you're going to chip in.
Yeah, I do like the premise because I think there's skin in the game for everybody. It's interesting, Tom. I have whiplash now because the ascendant accountability movement in K-12, we're going to close the achievement gap, no child left behind, all that. That's very much waning. However, in higher ed, where it was completely unfashionable, and I was excoriated in the aftermath of the Spellings Commission to even talk about these sorts of things, the script has flipped. And so part of the One Big Beautiful Bill is about accountability. There's negotiated rulemaking going on right now. Let's make our higher ed institutions accountable. And frankly, Texas has been a leader on a lot of the data systems that are going to be required. Harrison Keller here and University of North Texas is a real leader on that. So we are starting down the line of understanding what you're getting in higher ed.
We've also seen higher ed move radically to the left. Faculty, most institutions, I think it's fair to say, are probably 95% far left, not left, but far left. We see it in terms of the classroom with students really feeling that they're canceled out if they take positions that are out of the norm of a far left institution. This administration has reacted by saying, we are going to pull research money, but also in a number of cases say, You have to have curriculum approved, and you have to have faculty hiring approved by the federal government. Where do you fall on this? And is it really the government? I'm not sure any of us want to be far left, but I'm not sure we want the government
we definitely do not
to talk about
That's a
who
big
hires.
Overcorrection. And by the way, may I say that the people who are paying the bills at the University of Texas are the great people of Texas, and the people who pay their tuition.
And in those cases, putting them into programs where there's just no jobs.
Well, exactly. And so we have a governance apparatus that starts with the people who are paying the bills in state government. And in the tuition-paying community. So I think it's an overcorrection. I don't want to pshaw this at all, but, capitalists do capitalism and are in the private sector creating value. That's what they're supposed to do. And, do you want to pursue a PhD and teach, humanities at Austin College? Probably not. So anyway, I think some of it's a little oversold. And if we really did what we were supposed to be doing on teaching kids to read and discern and understand, they can make those discernments themselves.
Kyle wants to get me off the Department of Education.
No,
it's all good. But one more big question.
Yeah.
This administration, you led the organization for 4 years.
Yeah.
The Department of Education.
Right.
This administration's intent is to gut it.
Yeah.
4 major functions of it, 3 of them have been pushed to other agencies, parts of the government.
Not really. But
so what do you think of this administration? What do you think? Do we need an education department? Period.
I think we do, because I think it's a more efficient way to do business if and when we're doing it right. Now, can the thing be improved? You betcha. But, is chopping it up and saying to our school districts and our universities, okay, if you've got a student safety problem, call the Justice Department. If you've got a, measles outbreak, call HHS. If you want a student loan question, call Commerce. It's not a very efficient way to run the thing. What I worry about is it's just a big distraction from keeping the main thing. The main thing, do you know how difficult it's going to be to, undo the data systems here and put them over there and whatnot? But the truth of the matter is it hadn't been dismantled any more than every other federal agency is being gutted. And so, look, my successor, Secretary McMahon, is charged with enforcing the law as Congress has written it on IDEA, on Title I, on civil rights, and on and on. And she took an oath to enforce those laws. And so, the courts are going to litigate these things, and they're going to say, how are you enforcing the law with no staff? Yeah. So, but I think at the end of the day, there's not 60 votes to eliminate the Department of Education, and the cuts that are being made, some of which are probably worthy, and others, will be restored over time.
Transient.
Yeah.
One last question on this before we move on.
See, I was going to move on.
I see. I'm taking us back. One last question here. We talked about kind of loosely of like, okay, we're not keeping the main thing. We can't read, we can't write, we're not doing math, all the things.
Right.
And we look at, I think, the results of that as being, obviously very negative. But talk about the long-term impact. So talk about the 30 years from now.
Right.
When you have a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations
of D students.
Exactly. Talk about the long-term impact of what that means for a society, an economy, et cetera.
Yeah.
Give us your perspective.
And the competitiveness of our U.S. economy.
Right.
It's not good. Simple as that. And we ought to be, to your point, we ought to just be on fire about it. And that's why, a president, a bully pulpit, we have to have the right kind of leadership that is about that, because we, are a nation at risk, as Ronald Reagan said and continues to be true. And this idea that our expectation of this system and of our children and our people is that this is good enough is just wrong. And we're going to be a nation of haves and have-nots. And, the ability to use AI is the ability to query and the ability to read and the ability to discern and the ability to, we know that the technology is going to be way smarter and more comprehensive and learned, if you will, in terms of the content than any human being could possibly, any teacher. And what our schools need to do is teach those character, that working together, the responsibility, the show up, the do work, and to continue to focus on the basic skills that are going to make you adaptable for the many changes ahead.
And Margaret, you've been a strong advocate on looking at the education, not just from a domestic issue, but as a U.S. competitive issue.
Absolutely.
If you look at our reading scores, our math scores, we're in the OECD countries, 39, 40 countries. we're in the third quartile.
I know. I imagine that the Chinese and the Indians are looking and laughing and saying, because the rest of the world has accelerated dramatically. I mean, while we're going down, they're going up. And it's at our peril.
Yeah, and we've got roughly 40% of our students going to college. China, back in the 80s, early 90s, had 9%. Today, they're over 60%.
Yeah.
Big change. And that ought to get people really worried about what it's going to be like in those 10 or 20 years.
Yeah.
It's your analogy of the ostrich.
Yeah, we're going to need a Sputnik kind of moment again, I fear, to be a wake-up call.
What is that moment? What do you see it being?
Well, I think we'll have a major, I'm prognosticating here, technological threat. People, it will have to become personal to people economically before people to say, holy cow.
Got to wake up.
Wake up, yeah.
Post the Bush presidency, you then come to the Bush Center here in Dallas, Texas.
Yep.
And you're the leader of it. So talk about your time there, what the initiatives were that you led with the president and Mrs. Bush, and why those were important to you to go work on for, call it, three or so years post.
Yeah. So when I arrived, I mean, the first step when you create a presidential library is to build the facility and to become the repository for the various documents and historical elements and the museum and all of those sorts of things. And my predecessor, Mark Langdale, did a fantastic job along with the board of doing that. And then when I showed up, the thing that needed to be attended to was the policy aspects. And obviously, I knew President Bush well, had been the domestic policy lead and so forth, and he knew what he wanted to focus on. And they didn't want to just be a think tank; they wanted to be a kind of a do tank, a convener, and so forth. And so. One of the things, and of course, maximize that relationship with SMU and be on a university campus. So one of the things that I think has been the most important kind of hubs of the work there is around leadership, which obviously SMU is about developing leaders. So whether it's the Presidential Leadership Scholars Program or things involving women or veterans, that's been a wraparound thesis. And it's, going strong. They have focused their policy agenda and, they make a difference. I think what I hear from people is, they wish the Bush Center would speak out on more controversial things, but they stick to their knitting. That's not the Bush way.
No, not the Bush way.
Yeah.
Let me talk. We've gone through decades of your leadership, and you've encountered some tough situations. We talked about some of those, Department of Education. Clearly, the challenges that you have is in the White House are almost daily.
Right. Yeah.
You encountered something called the Buster situation almost immediately after you from Secretary of Education.
That wasn't the worst. Little did I know. That
at the University of North Carolina,
that was a tough one.
On that.
Yeah.
You were
cheating.
You were taking on a position of an individual that had just been fired.
Yeah.
The selection process was criticized.
Yeah.
The chairman resigned the day after your selection. And then on the first day that you took office at UNC, 6 of the campuses, the student faculty walked out. So talk about...
It's a fun start.
That was a fun start.
Don't take it personally.
But talk a little bit about those situations, and not just from a leadership standpoint of what you had to do.
Yeah.
Still leading an organization that had to get things done.
Yeah.
But also from the standpoint of a person or an individual. When those things come at you, I think all of us encounter tough situations. I'm not sure as tough as those, but we all encounter. What did you learn personally from those situations, both from kind of leadership, but also how you personally kind of move
soldier through? Yeah. So, and I was obviously from Texas, not from North Carolina. And, Texas and North Carolina are fascinating places because they're the two stickiest states in the country. I mean, they have a ton of pride in their states. And if you're born and grew up in Texas, you're going to stay in Texas. Likewise, North Carolina, the two stickiest states in the country. So I wasn't from here. And so the first thing I did was get about the state. I made it my mission within my first month to go to every one of these 17 places.
Understand the culture.
Understand the culture, meet the people, confront the people who are protesting you, and I kept saying, give me a chance. I mean, just give me a chance. That's all I'm asking for. And eventually won them over. That was the half full part of the deal. Then we got into the transgender bathrooms, the Confederate monuments, the remnants of the athletic cheating, and the dealings with the conferences.
And that was the UNC basketball situation.
UNC basketball situation and so forth. So a high water mark was, a state legislature that had passed the bathroom bill. I don't know if y'all know, but there's a lot of bathrooms in university campuses and then the dorms and the sporting arenas and whatnot, being sued over that issue by the Obama administration. So this is obviously President Obama, and, threatening our federal funding.
Right.
And, and a faculty and a student body that was very much in an uproar over that policy and kind of standing on that thin reed in the middle trying to, keep the main thing the main thing.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
So anyway, that was challenging.
And you had to deal with the law as it was and the monies and the research.
Absolutely.
Talk to us about the Buster situation, because that, again, going after NPR.
Yeah. Well, it was, public broadcasting, not NPR. It was a different deal. Anyway, so the Department of Education, and I assume does not do any of this now, but there were funds appropriated to do educational programming on public broadcasting. And there was a show called, Travels with Buster. And one of the shows had this, and remember, this is, a long time ago. I mean, our whole way we think about these issues.
That's 2004.
2004 or 5 was an episode where Buster, this bunny, this rabbit, was visiting. Sounds kind of weird to talk about. Was visiting a farm in Vermont, and the farm was owned by 2 women with children and whatnot. And so I got, there was a lot of blowback about public money, and the show was for like 3 and 4-year-old kids. And my issue was not, to be a, moral judge of anybody. But, what is it that's important to be telling little children? I mean, do we need to get into sexuality of any kind at that age?
Exactly. Right.
And so that was what the real issue was. And when, a lot of congressional interest and public interest on both sides of that issue.
We were laughing earlier about bipartisan in Washington.
Yeah.
But you lead the Bipartisan Policy Center. Important institution, does some phenomenal work. Tell us about that institution and what it's doing today, what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, well, I'm going to tell you first that the reason that the government is open today is because of bipartisanship. Now, it was a win-ugly sort of situation, but,
a little bit late in the game.
A little bit late in the game. I mean, whatever. But the point is, because of the filibuster, God bless the filibuster, people still have to come together. We have been working a lot on housing. Elizabeth Warren and Tim Scott, 2 names you don't see together often, the chair and the ranking and the Senate Banking Committee unanimously passed a big piece of housing legislation about 6 weeks ago that got attached to the National Defense Authorization legislation that is must-pass legislation this year. So, you find the opportunities where you can, and that's one of them. People across the aisle are concerned about housing. Childcare is another area where there's a lot of bipartisan interest. Energy permitting is something that we're bullish on and is going to, there were all these investments made and promised in the infrastructure law, and the resources haven't gotten out because of permitting issues. Exactly. And so, where do you find those openings and work where you can? That's what we do.
Long history in education, obviously very successful career. What do you want your legacy to be remembered by?
Well, like you and like everybody, that you made a difference on things that mattered, and I hope. I mean, I'm still trying to do that.
Obviously,
I'm not. I wouldn't declare victory by any stretch. And I talked to our friend Tom Luce the other day. The fact that the boulder rolls up and down the hill, and you have to kind of constantly use whatever leadership position you have to remind people of our first principles and, continue to elevate what works. And so we got to do it again.
You've made a difference.
All right.
You've made a big difference, and we appreciate all the service here in Texas, but on a national basis.
All right, well, save a spot
education.
for me, because like all Texans, I'm coming back.
So what do you want to do? What's ahead for Margaret?
I don't, I would like to, be in a university as an adjunct or something, talking about, people used to call me after No
I don't
Child
think
Left
that's
Behind.
going to be a tough one. My guess is you're going to get a lot of calls right
but,
now.
I mean, people, used to, kids who were getting a PhD in public policy making would call me to be interviewed about how really No Child Left Behind got made, and they had this kind of made up stuff, and that's not what happened anyway. So just to give some of the practical aspects of how you can be successful. I'm not the smartest person in the world, but I do know how to bring people together and get stuff done. So
you're pretty smart and you've got a lot done.
Okay,
Margaret,
that's
thanks
what I'm
for being
do.
with
All
us
right,
so much.
thank you, Tom.
This is terrific.
Thank you, Kyle. Good to see you.
Thank you for watching today's episode. Again, today's episode is sponsored by Clay Cooley Automotive, a family-owned, family-operated automotive company serving the local DFW Metroplex for over 22 years.